All right, looks like we're all set. So good morning, everyone. We'll call our meeting to order. Just a couple of non-business items before we start, but we did have two members who recently have gone off the commission. Jerry Mowen, who was the director of our Office of Forensic Services and was a commission member, retired from DCJS. So after, I think, 36 years as a district attorney and assistant district attorney, and 28 years as the elected district attorney, and several years at DCJS, he decided it was time to relax. So he left, and as I understand it, he's helping try a murder case right now in his spare time. So we did want to recognize Jerry for his service, and also Superintendent George Beach, retired as superintendent of the state police, and we do want to recognize him for his service on the commission as well. So we will be preparing plaques, and we'll have the plaques delivered to both of them. But just wanted to publicly recognize both of them for the work that they did and for their service on the commission. With that aside, welcome everyone. Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. We appreciate it. The first item we have on our agenda is a review and approval of our meeting agenda. That agenda was provided to all the commission members. Do we have any comments or discussion with regard to the agenda? All right. And if not, do I have a motion to approve the agenda? All right, do I have a second?
With one addition?
Yes.
Oh, the agenda?
Yeah, if you want to just indicate what that is.
Sure. I was hoping to have a discussion, just started a conversation about genetic genealogy and whether or not the commission is going to play some role in that process in New York.
So if it's all right with everyone, without committing to any resolution, but just starting the discussion, we'll put that under new, or we'll deal with that under new business. So with that addition, do I have a motion to approve the agenda? Scott, do I have a second? Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Our next item is a review and approval of the draft minutes from our December 7th, 2018 meeting. And again, those minutes were circulated to all the commission members. Are there any comments or discussion with regard to the minutes of that meeting? And if not, do I have a motion to approve those minutes? Do I have a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, and that carries, both of those have carried unanimously. Next item we have are the accreditations and laboratory updates. I don't believe we have any accreditations on today. I believe they're all laboratory updates. The first item we have is the Monroe County Office of the Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. We did receive an email dated December 21st of last year with regard to a change in key management. There's also an organizational chart provided, but basically naming David Nemeth as the Assistant Chief Toxicologist. Are there any questions or discussion with regard to that item? Right, next, we have the Nassau County Division of Forensic Science. There's a few different issues. The first, and I think they're related, relates to something that we discussed, I believe, at our prior meeting, but there is an appeal with regard to an issue that ANAB raised with one of the inspections with regard to validation. And I don't know, Pat, if you want to address that issue at all or give us an update in terms of where you're at.
Karen's here, so I'm going to have her come up.
Okay.
Hi, Karen Dooling. We had two nonconformities initially. One had to do with how we document the technical leader for the biology section, reviewing quality events and procedures and policies. We appealed that to both the FBI and ANAB, and that finding was overturned. And then the second finding that we had to do with our validation. We deduce a clear major component when it's there, regardless of the number of contributors, and they felt this wasn't properly represented in our validation. We also appealed this finding to both ANAB and the FBI. The FBI overturned it, So, according to the FBI, we had no nonconformances. ANAB sustained it. So, we did provide information to ANAB. We did some addendum to our current validation, and they have accepted that plan, but that hasn't been reviewed by the DNA subcommittee yet.
All right, thank you. It's my understanding that that's going to be on before the DNA subcommittee at their next meeting. One question I had, if I remember right, you indicated at one of our last meetings that you are working on coming online with the mixture deconfliction software. Is my memory correct on that?
That's correct.
And if and when you come online with that, I assume that this whole issue would be moot then?
Correct.
Correct. We're already migrating from the current validation to a new validation, which we've also done the addendum for, even though that hasn't been reviewed, and then we'll be moving to probabilistic.
We're about, I'd say we're about 4/5 done with the validation. So we're just at this point now waiting to set up with training, and then everything will move from there. Training the DA's office, training the police department, and so forth. Training our users as to the conversion from random match to likelihood ratios. So we're pretty close.
When do you anticipate taking that to the DNA subcommittee? Would that be at the next meeting or subsequent meeting?
The next meeting's about a month away.
No.
We won't be ready then.
No, we should be ready by June, July.
Okay, thank you. All right, any questions with regard to that item?
Just a couple. What's the time period between the nonconformity that was found by ANAB and are there? You mentioned validation studies. Are the validation studies just simply for StarMix? Are you doing validation studies based on the nonconformity? In terms of redefining or further defining clear mixture and the validations, I guess, concerning mixture interpretation where there are more than 3 contributors.
So we did an addendum to validation that was done 2 years ago for what we're currently online with. And that addendum was for clear major. Although there were no concerns noted with current casework, we did that addendum, and that addendum has been approved by ANAB. Separately, we're also doing validation for probabilistic genotyping.
And so the addendum didn't involve any. I guess the question was whether there was any other validation work that went into, to address the nonconformity, or am I just misreading that in the report?
Yeah, that would be the addendum. The addendum is the additional work on the validation that was performed that had to do with the nonconformity.
And what's the scope of that addendum or those validations?
The scope was just an expansion of some different mixture components and the number of contributors, and the validation supported what we're currently doing.
When you say expand, to look at mixtures of 4 and 5, mixtures concerning 4 and 5 contributors, well, what was the expansion for?
That's correct. I believe we went up to 6 contributors, and the mixture ratios were ratios where one of the ratios would be major compared to the other components.
Okay, and is this information? And then this is the information that's going to go before the subcommittee at the subcommittee's next meeting. The extent of the validation studies, or is that simply going to be for the StarMix validation studies?
The addendum with the additional validation that will go before the subcommittee at the next meeting. We're not ready with StarMix at this time to submit that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I don't know if this is the right time. Can we get an update on the transition to the new building?
Let's still come.
Or is that later?
Yeah, I think we do have that later in the agenda.
Fine. Okay, sorry.
Mike?
Yes.
Mike, this is Lydia. I just wanted to then follow up. This work that's being done is going to be a stopgap or a filler as they transition from this interpretation method to StarMix? Or is it StarMix or I don't know what the vendor is, probabilistic phenotyping. So when do you think you're actually going to anticipate being online with PG? A year?
I'd say about, we've been working on this for about 6 months now. And the joy of StarMix is that the vendor does the majority of the validations for you, and then there is some local responsibilities. We're pretty much done with the majority of the work. It's a matter of sitting down with the vendor, going over the project itself. Do we want to add to it? Do we think we need to expand? And at the same time, there's the training aspect too. So I'd say June, July, and that's a pretty aggressive date, but we're trying for July.
And how many people do you need to train?
We're going to train all of biology.
Okay.
That's what, 13, but that includes Karen and I.
Okay. I'm done.
All right, thank you. Next, we have the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner Forensic Biology Laboratory. This is a continuation of accreditation. There's a final surveillance report. There's remediation documents that were submitted. And then there's an email with regard to their submission to DCJS. Do we have someone here from OCME?
Yes.
And who is that? Maybe if you can just say your name.
Meredith Rosenberg, Quality Assurance Manager.
Good morning. My question, maybe it's more of a statement than a question, but relates more to the process of obtaining documentation from OCME than the actual content of the documents. But my recollection is that this is something we dealt with or addressed at the last meeting. I think we've addressed it previously, but my understanding from staff is that we are not routinely getting documentation regarding communication between OCME and ANAB, and that our staff is continuously having to reach out and request that documentation to get it. And I just would remind both the OCME and all laboratories that this commission has an obligation with regard to accreditation. And we have not, we've outsourced the obligation of doing inspections of the labs to ANAB. We have not outsourced the accreditation. We independently make decisions on accreditation. It's something I take very seriously, and I know I speak for the rest of the commission members in indicating they do as well. In addition, if you look at 9 New York Code of Rules and Regulations, section 6190.4, the language is pretty clear that laboratories seeking accreditation must provide first documentation of their accreditation. Secondly, all documentation submitted to ASCLD Lab, or in this case ANAB, is part of the either accreditation process or continuing compliance requirements. And third, all documentation received by the lab from ASCLD Lab, or in this case ANAB. It doesn't seem to be ambiguous to me. It seems to be pretty clear, and I just want to make clear that it's the position of this commission that the OCME and every other lab needs to be submitting this documentation to the commission through the Office of Forensic Services. And the Office of Forensic Services should not have to be calling in every instance to try and track these documents down. So if you could relay to Director Cooper-Schmidt for me my concern and my statement here, and if he has any concerns or any issues with regard to it, he's welcome to add it to the next meeting as an agenda item and come before the commission. We'd be happy to discuss it with him as a commission. But I thought I made it clear last meeting, and I'm attempting to make it crystal clear now that we expect a more transparent process in terms of the document production of communications between the lab and ANAB going forward. So please relay that message for me, and I appreciate it. Does anyone else have? Thank you. Anyone else have any questions regarding this item?
Is it, the material submitted, I don't know what percentage is blacked out, but is that what you're referencing, or is that part of what you're referencing?
No, we didn't. My understanding from staff is that we didn't even get the materials, that we had to affirmatively call and request these materials. They were not provided to us, and this isn't the first time that's happened. It's happened repeatedly recently.
I mean, I don't understand why all this stuff is blacked out. Is there some confidential personnel matter?
Shelley, can you speak to that?
Yes, I think we've discussed this in recent meetings, but certain staff, if they fall under key or top management, those names are public, but other staff members, their names would be redacted. And so the people who conducted this particular audit, it's an internal audit, that information gets redacted out. And I believe it was redacted prior to us having it, so that sometimes the labs do that and sometimes we do that as staff. So.
Yeah, the only issue is it's with the comments, they're in their entirety. It's not as if there's personal information. It's like, the other ones have, bits and pieces that are redacted, but this whole thing is, as I'm looking at it, completely unhelpful. So, who would know what questions to ask? I mean, you could black out the identifying information, cases and stuff like that.
Can't possibly all be names.
Right.
Is that the way it came to us?
This is the way it came. So my guess is, in that comment box, the initials of who made the comment would be there, and then that's how it was redacted.
Case number.
Or a case number. Sometimes they're looking at cases. Yeah.
It's a large case.
Let me ask this of Meredith.
Must be some Sam case or something.
David, can you give us a page number or something so that I can
I'm on
refer?
page 96. I mean,
83 through 107.
So either Pat or Scott, if you could share with Meredith those pages. Could you explain to us, first of all, whether or not there's material other than names in that column, and if so, why it's blacked out?
So the particular nonconformance that was documented during our external surveillance visit pertained to the documentation of the assessors during our internal audit. This was for our internal audit. The issue that the external surveillance auditor had was that we did not show conformance with every single standard. We had a checklist, which you could see that everything's been checked off for this particular internal audit. When we're documenting our conformance, we're looking at case records. That information typically is not encouraged to be released by our legal department. And so I did discuss turning over all of the documents that we turned over to ANAB to show conformance and remediation for our findings with members of DCJS, and we discussed redacting the information, and so I did get the okay to do that before I sent this, and so this is the redaction of that information. So there are initials of people who did look at particular cases and information, and so for ease of turning this document over to DCJS, which really just shows that we did perform the task that the external assessor had an issue with. I did discuss this prior to turning over this document in this state.
Any questions either with regard to that or anything further?
Not really. I mean, it's just, I guess it's just unhelpful looking at it in block form, because I'm sure there were considerations made for each of the lines that were blocked out, but it's just, in this way it's just hard to tell, because a lot of the things that are listed beneath that have non-applicable, they give like a one-line reason why it's not applicable. At least you have some sense of, what's meant by the report.
So
There's not enough here to be helpful in terms of asking questions.
I hear
So
what you're
much of it's
saying. I guess, are
collected.
you asking that we look for a more limited redacted, a version that limits the redaction?
I think so, or at the very least send it, with the unredacted copy to you. You could figure out whether there's anything that needs to be shared.
Is there a way that you can redact the initials and names off of there without blocking everything out so that it would be a little more helpful to the commission members?
I could surely do that. The only reason that this document was turned over is because it was part of our corrections for our external surveillance visit, just to show the surveillance assessor that we did more than just note in the checklist that we're in conformance. We noted what we looked at to show that we're in conformance. Typically, notes like this are not usually made public, which is why we were so aggressive in redacting it. We typically don't put these documents out as a public document.
Is that something you provided to NAB?
Yes.
Yeah, then I think it's
Why
pretty
we-
clear under the section of the regulations they just read you that it's something that needs to be provided to the commission. I'm certainly sensitive to the need to redact information. There's a request which seems pretty reasonable from the commission. You can go through and redact the information that needs to be redacted without blocking the entire section out, and provide that would be appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you. Anything else? All right, thank you. Next, we have the New York City Police Department.
Thank you.
Police Laboratory. And there's a letter dated December 21st of 2018 regarding continuation of accreditation. There was an off-site review conducted in December, and then there were no findings. So, Scott, congratulations to the lab on that. Any questions or comments with regard to this item? All right, thank you. Next, we have New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services Latent Print Laboratory, and this relates to the continuation of accreditation and the remediation for nonconformance. We do have Charlie Clark, who's acting as the lab director here in Albany, if anyone has any questions. All right. Next, we have New York State Police Crime Laboratory. It's a letter dated December 20th regard to a change in top management, indicating that Major Nicholas Banbury has been named Assistant Lab Director. And I believe Ray is here in Albany with us. Any questions with regard to this item? Next, we have Niagara County Sheriff's Office and Forensic Laboratory. It's a letter dated December 25th of this year with regard to continuation of accreditation. Attached final surveillance report. There was an off-site review conducted in February. There were no findings. So again, congratulations to the laboratory. Any questions with regard to this item? Next, we have the Westchester County Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory. There's an email from January 14th of this year with regard to a change in top or key management, indicating that Lieutenant James Alonzo has been named Assistant Laboratory Director. I believe, do we have Director Harrison here with us? If you could, and maybe you can just come up to the table a minute, please. Maybe if you could just clarify for me how the structure works, in terms of your position and Lieutenant Palonzo's position, what the reporting structure is.
Sure. We've included our organizational chart with our submissions to DCJS, and we're in the process of rewriting our manuals for compliance to the new ISO and ANAP standards. In an effort to ensure the continuity and smooth operation of the lab, we decided to fill a previously vacant position of assistant lab director. I currently serve as the lab director for the police lab. Lieutenant Palazzo, although outranks me in the police structure, serves as like our liaison with upper management for the police, for the Westchester County Police.
And so he's going to be serving as assistant lab director as well?
Correct.
Does anyone have any questions? All right, thank you.
You got it.
Next, we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology. And again, we have letters, one from December of last year, one from January of this year, one from February of this year, all relating to change in top management in the lab, indicating in some that Betsy Spratt retired effective January 30th, that for a period of time the acting director was Thomas Camporisi, that on February 25th of this year, Christopher Cording was named laboratory director. Any questions or comments with regard to this item?
Mike, this is Scott.
Yes.
I
Yes, Scott.
think usually we get the resume of the individual, no? Or we get some information about the new laboratory director and their background.
We do. Did we get one or no?
We did not. It's not always consistent. We can request one if the members would like.
Yeah, I would like one, please, if we could. We will send a request and we'll circulate it. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. All right, that's everything we have for accreditations and lab updates. Next, we have new business. The first item we have our annual laboratory summaries that go along with our laboratory certifications. Those have all been provided. Again, I'm going to make a comment here, directed to all the laboratory directors and staff. And some labs are great in terms of providing this information to staff, and we really appreciate it. My staff informed me that they've received significant pushback from several labs. Labs indicating that they don't think they should have to provide the material, or that maybe the Office of Forensic Services should drive to the labs and look at it. And I just want to make very clear that, first of all, this isn't something we do just because we feel like it. This is a requirement. If you read the statute requires that this certification be done. And secondly, if you read the statute requires this commission to keep records and to archive those records. And us driving to a lab and looking at what you have somewhere is not in any way, shape, or form going to satisfy this commission's obligation. So, one lab told my staff that they were too busy to do this. Frankly, if you're too busy to do this, you're too busy to be an accredited lab in the state of New York. So I would appreciate if all lab directors and their staff, would take the time to look at the requirements, understand this commission's obligation. We bend over backwards to try and work with labs. We'll work with you on, the easiest format for you to provide the information. We'll take it electronically. Whatever we can do to help facilitate the process, we will do. But, we're not doing this as some academic exercise. We're doing it because there's a statute that requires us to do this in connection with the accreditation process. So, for those of you who worked with us and provided the information seamlessly, we appreciate it. And for those of you who didn't, we anticipate that process will improve going forward. So putting the process aside, any questions or comments with regard to anything in the annual laboratory summaries? Next, we have, with regard to commission communications, and again, no votes required here, but we did provide communications with regard to new lab directors, other information with regard to commission member information, memorandums of understanding. It's my understanding that we have executed memorandums of understanding now from all the laboratories, with the exception of the New York City Police Laboratory. And I think, Scott, you're working with us to get that through your legal department and get that to us. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
All right. Any questions with regard to that material? All right, and then our added item, and you indicated that you wanted to start a discussion.
Sure. So everyone's aware of the cold cases that are being solved using the approach of genetic genealogy. If it's done by a commercial laboratory, that laboratory has to be permitted by the Department of Health. That's been determined. And we have one lab that's actively trying to produce the required validation documents, and another lab that's already permitted, Bodie, is doing some of this and is aware that if they want to do it on New York State cases, they'll need that test validation approved by the Department of Health. But in conversations about this internally in the Department of Health and with others, and with some feedback of activities and discussions at the recent AAFS meeting that I did not attend, but Ray did, and maybe he could speak to that. There have been a couple issues raised whereby we're wondering if, taking the approach similar to what we did with familial searching, we can ease concerns that the public may have about this use of this technology. And set up parameters that would protect any victim DNA profiles, for example, and how they're used in this process, and maybe put some parameters around the use of the open genetic DNA databases and how that will be done, so that in theory, if technically possible, you could keep that search private from the public at large, so that that crime scene profile didn't exist on that open platform where you could potentially have an innocent family member search and make a hit on that and then cause some confusion for them. So I know we're going to run into questions about this, and I actually think that these aspects of it are more appropriate for the Commission than for the Department of Health. And so I just wanted to kind of open the conversation about it.
So maybe if I could, a couple of questions. First, as I understand it, is it Parabon, I think you made an application?
Correct.
And then you indicated, is it Bodie that has indicated they intend to?
They haven't said that they intend to, but they're aware that if they want to offer it for New York State cases, they need to go through that process.
Where is the Parabon application in terms of process at DOH?
So they've formally applied, and they've provided some documents, but they have further validation documents that they're preparing at this time. And I can't give you an idea of time frame in terms of what's going on there.
All right, and then I guess the last thing I put on the table, just a thought, and I think we need to do a little more research. But one question that comes to mind is, what would the Commission's legal authority be to act in a situation where we're dealing with a lab that's not a public forensic laboratory? I think, in both of those cases you cited, they're, if I understand correctly, private laboratories from out of state. So, I think we would need to look at the statute and look at our grant of authority and, and look carefully in terms of whether or not the Commission, legally has a role. And I suppose the other thing to look at is, I don't know if there's language in the Department of Health authorizing statutes or regulations that would allow the Department of Health to grant authority to this body or not. But that, one question that comes to my mind, I don't disagree with you that this does seem to fall within our, in terms of the subject matter at least, seems to fall within the scope of issues that we regularly deal with, and it would seem to make sense for us to have some voice in terms of regulating how this type of DNA testing is done. I'm just, have some concern about legally, given our enabling statute, whether or not we have the ability to do it with a private laboratory.
Does anybody, Ann, if you know, Parabon, as I understand it, you give them not a profile, but you give them the actual DNA, and they will give you
So the
description of the perpetrator.
Well, the way it works right now is they partner with a wet lab that does the actual DNA analysis. So you send the extract to them, and they perform the profiling. And in this case, at least the initial test that Parabon is working on is a SNP panel. They provide the SNP panel raw data to Parabon, and then they use their algorithms to look at matches in GEDmatch, and then they take that list and give it to their genealogists, and they try and further narrow down the list of possible.
There's a case that I saw in Massachusetts where unknown perpetrator, they sent the DNA sample to Parabon, and Parabon is in South somewhere?
Well, Parabon is in Virginia, I believe, and their partner lab is in Georgia.
They sent it to Virginia, and what Parabon gave to the police or DA's office, once they had a general age description of the individual, was what this person would look like. And they caught the guy, and it was remarkable. Now, I'm sure I always remember my old case where we used to do facial reconstruction on the skeletons, and the guy comes in from Oklahoma and tells us the victim's a Native American, from the Onondaga Nation, and it turns out to be, African American guy from the South Side. So I think this is a little more reliable than that, though. So that's not technically genealogy search?
Well, they also offer phenotype analysis, which is what you're speaking of. So they look for hair color, eye color. And they also do genetic geography-based analyses to say, the likelihood of where this person is descended from. And they'll offer that as well. But it seems like the more powerful aspect of what they're doing is the genetic genealogy.
So the question is, Syracuse Police Department has a semen sample from a rape victim, and she's unable to identify anyone. Does the Syracuse Police Department need approval from the Forensic Science Commission to send that to Parabon or Bodie or anywhere else? Is that the question?
So I think that's one of the things being put on the table is, should the commission have a role in that? I think right now, if you want to send it to a private lab, you need to send it to a private lab that has been, is it licensed? Is that the right term? Permitted by the Department of Health. And what Ann is putting on the table is, should the commission have a role in this process, either in addition to or instead of the Department of Health? And while I don't disagree in principle, my concern is, is there a statutory basis, or regulatory basis for us to get involved? And I think it's something that's worth looking at.
And I see your point, because in familial searching, it's because they were using the CODIS, the state CODIS, that we had a role. So I do understand.
Actually two roles. They were public forensic labs operating in the state, and they were seeking to access the state database. Here, at least in the scenario you've given, it's neither. One question I had is, both of those, both running the genealogy process and the situation Bill describes, where they give you back, based on the DNA analysis of profile, both of those rely on that SNP testing as the underlying basis, don't they?
At this point, for Parabon, yes.
All right. And I believe that we've had one or more labs indicate to us that they are looking into doing that SNP testing here for our public forensic lab. So I guess, another question is, to does Parabon insist on using their private lab to do the testing, or would they also take SNP test results, from, let's just say New York State Police Lab, for example. If New York State Police Lab, developed testing protocol, did a validation study, brought it before the DNA subcommittee, got approval, was approved by the commission to do the SNP testing, would Parabon then take the results of their testing and do a genealogy or do, one of these profile type tests?
There's no reason that they couldn't unless they've entered into some sort of exclusive contract with the wet lab. But I'm thinking that they're not progressing along those lines because they've mentioned a possible second wet lab. So my impression is that they would be open to that.
Because then there'd at least be some basis then if the wet testing is being done here.
Right.
I think there would be a much stronger connection to the statute, in terms of this commission's mandate. But I don't know.
Ray, are you willing to just speak about what your plans are at the Forensic Investigation Center?
So we just acquired a sequencer in the crate Monday. So our intentions are to look into, but given that it hasn't even been uncrated, this is really very much future. We're certainly planning on looking into it, but certainly the private labs are way out in front in terms of they're actually offering a service live right now, and ours obviously will be sometime down the road, assuming that all these pieces come together for us.
Right. And I think OCME is in a similar position.
I mean, part of the, I guess, issue is that, if the state police or OCME does it, then there's a process that we have to know that whether it is actually reliable or not, or whether we're busting down the wrong person's door. So that's going to go before the forensic subcommittee. You can have a group of scientists that look at and try and figure out what reliable means in terms of SNPs or Parabon or whatever. And then we can figure out the legal structure. And then the danger, I guess, of private labs, they're housed out of state. The power, to get to information that they have or may have in terms of how reliable their testing process is. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the subpoena or what state court subpoena power is to get that information. They're for-profit institutions. Obviously, they're selling a product, and so they may be moving out ahead of the science. They may not be moving out ahead of the science. They may be cautious and deliberate, but they may be moving ahead of the science. So there are certainly concerns about hiring out services for when we have no real way to check in state the reliability of the process, and at least we know in state when we have accredited labs is the process we go to figure it out, and then we could also hammer out what the scope of law, whether there are restrictions on law enforcement or not. I just don't know enough about Parabon to say one way or the other.
Yeah, no, I think those are good points. It's not just Parabon, it's the lab, it's also the lab that they're subcontracting with to do the wet testing. And all of the things that we just talked about, getting and understanding the documentation with regard to their accreditation and, any issues they had and what they did to remediate those issues. We would have none of that. So I think, that to me lends some support to, what Ann's putting on the table. What I just don't have a clear picture of is what our authority to do that is. And, possibly if there's some provision that would allow the Department of Health to, designate or, grant their power to license in this area to the commission, then the commission would be free, if they choose to say, if you want to operate in New York and you want to do this, here's the parameters under which you can do it. Make it very similar to what we do, that you have to be accredited and that you have to, provide us with all of your accreditation documents. And, then that would at least give us some insight into the things you're talking about. But you're right, short of that, we're kind of flying blind, which is not a comfortable position to be in. But I just, Yeah, so I guess what I would suggest is between now and the next meeting, have our DCGS legal department look into this, and also if you could have the Department of Health legal department look into whether or not, they think there's any basis to, somehow transfer the authority the Department of Health has to this commission, whether or not there's any basis to do it and whether or not there's any interest in doing it.
Sure.
And we can look from the DCGS side and see whether or not we think there's any basis. And again, in principle, I think those are great points, and the only way that we have any say over those things is if we have a role in this process. But I just, legally I'm struggling with how we get.
I don't know, but the concern is like earlier this morning we talked about a lab having non-conformity, and they're going back into they're presenting to the forensic subcommittee. It's a lab that's been accredited for years and obviously has a great reputation. So, but there's some comfort in that where there's a non-conformity and they're going back to a group of scientists to show their validation work. If they, who knows what would be our recourse, even if they were reliable for certain aspects of the assay. What if there's a disagreement among scientists about whether it's reliable or not? Like, who's going to make that determination for our course, whether it should be admissible or not? So. Or then it'll be just left on the doorstep of a trial judge without the benefit of going through the subcommittee, and they kind of know what I know about science.
No, I think they're good points.
Yeah. But the one reassuring thing here is that once the investigative team identifies a likely perpetrator, they would use traditional forensic methods to do the direct match. So this is, for the most part, considered an investigative lead approach, although at times they say they are actually able to identify the person just because they happen to be in the public database.
And I certainly appreciate that, and it's similar to CODIS. Whenever we send the CODIS set out, we collectively, not we DCGS or the commission, there's a very tight warning on there saying that this is an investigative lead and that it should be followed up with an independent test before any action's taken. And so that that certainly gives us some concern, but I think the counter is that people would argue even that investigative lead could result in someone being the subject of a search warrant or having their door banged down or whatever the case may be. So I appreciate the points that are raised, and I think practically speaking, I do see a role for the commission in trying to make sure this is done in a way that's consistent with our standards. And the question is, do we have a legal basis to do it?
At what cutoff point do you have probable cause? So you're going to have a result. We don't know what the security of that result is. Is that sufficient to intrude on somebody? I mean,
but I think there's two questions there you raise. One, with regard to New York labs, we at least know that they're operating to a baseline standard that we in the DNA subcommittee have established. But ultimately, whether or not probable cause exists is a court question. But to your point, if Parabon subcontracts to a lab in Georgia, we don't have a clue. Whereas if we had a role, we could assert ourselves and say if you want to operate in New York. But the question is legally, to me at least, the question is, do we have a basis to do that? And I don't know the answer to it. I don't see one on the face of the statute. But
yeah, I asked my colleague in California to give me their protocols that they follow. So I'll email those to all the members of the commission. And I'm not advocating for them or advocating against them. It's just a starting point.
No, that'd be helpful.
And I'll just, for reassurance, I'll just remind folks that the permitted labs are audited every 2 years by the Department of Health, and they have to do, if they're considered a forensics lab, they have to follow the FBI quality assurance standards as applicable. Now, it differs a little bit in this new model where the wet lab just needs to show us that they're capable of performing a particular assay. So in the case of what's proposed, it's a particular SNP assay, and they need to show that they validate that, but there's no kind of forensic parameters around that because they're not going to be, working with the evidence and extracting DNA from the evidence and so forth.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you raising this. And, part of me, in terms of my initial reaction, also says we might be in a better place, if our New York State labs eventually are doing this testing under the structure we have. But, in the meantime, we've got to deal with it. So we'll put it on as an agenda item at our next meeting. Okay. And I appreciate you raising it. So next we have old business. And our first item relates to our ANAB and ABFT transition. We do have letters, one from December of last year, one from January of this year, with regard to the transition timeline. And I think in some, among other things, the letters indicate that the timeline is being pushed out, and that according to ANAB at least, all the New York State tox labs that are ABFT accredited, if I understand this properly, would have until about the middle of 2022 to become ANAB accredited under the new ANAB, I shouldn't say new, but under the ANAB standards. I'm sorry?
2023 and 2024, I think are one of the dates.
All right.
They received an update, sorry.
All right. So you're indicating it's now 2023 and 2024? All right. I guess for me, pushing this out, we've been dealing with this for several years already, and pushing this out 5 years from today, seems to be a long time for me. I don't know how other commission members feel, but we certainly are free as a commission to set our own. ANAB can set their standards and say when they're going to stop doing the ABFT accreditation. We're free as a commission to do our own. Scott, I don't know if you want to weigh in at all from the lab director perspective, or anyone else.
Yeah, Joe Avili's here. He's part of the toxicology lab director for Nassau County.
Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Commissioner. So we had a recent ANAB meeting amongst the toxicology labs, and we're roughly in agreement with what you're saying is that, and I don't want to speak for every laboratory, but I'll certainly speak for myself, and there was general agreement that all the laboratories are going to try to retain the current timeline that was initially outlined. Reason being is that, we're all kind of, as you said, we've been preparing for this for a while. There's really no turning back in our view at this point. So, again, I don't want to speak for every laboratory, but I think there's a general consensus that we want to follow the original timeline and try to meet that. As far as some updates, I believe the vast majority of the directors and their QC managers have had full training for the ANAB assessors course. I've individually had a couple of my other supervisory type people take the ANAB. It's a more of an abbreviated course, but they've conducted that. We have begun to adopt some of the necessary guidelines for 17025. In fact, I do have a corrective action going today in which I indicated that we have adopted a protocol for records retention that's consistent with that protocol, for example. Let me see if there's anything else I can think of. Our laboratory has recently adopted Qualtrics, and we are actively downloading our documents into that system. We're very much in the thick of it right now. So we are making, I think, progress. And as I said, not to belabor the point, but that our intention is to meet the original deadline. So I don't know if that generates any questions, but.
And just from my perspective, first of all, thank you. we realize it's an undertaking and appreciate the work that you're doing, appreciate the work that the other tox labs are doing to make this change. I know our staff has, worked in different ways to try and partner with you and help with the transition, and we continue to look at ways we can get you some more resources and provide assistance. But I certainly support that course of action. I think it's a better course of action. I don't know, does anyone else have any questions or comments?
I would just add that I agree. DCGS has been trying to, set up meetings and has been, helping us, along the way. So we certainly appreciate that help as well.
All right. Well, we will look forward to hearing more, and thank you for the update. We appreciate it and appreciate the work you're doing. Next, we have Nassau County, and the heading here is NIBIN update, but I also think this is the appropriate time to ask the question you raised before, Bill, in terms of the facility issues too. So let's start with NIBIN. We do have a letter from January 31st of this year. I don't know, Pat, is there anything you want to add?
I mean, it really stands as it is, other than that we've begun to move in. But in terms of NIBIN, it's still in use, and it's still being we're still reducing our backlogs with NIBIN. In terms of moving in, we do have an area that's prepared for it. The only issue is that a circuit would have to be moved prior to it going live in the laboratory.
It's my understanding right now it's being done in the police department.
It's in the police department proper, yes.
Right. Bill, did you have a question?
Yeah, Pat, I don't know if can you give us an update on the transition to the new lab?
Yes. So actually, I received information last night in terms of we've been moving our current disciplines. That started about 2 weeks ago. So as of right now, we're proceeding with moving 50% of bio, latent prints, and chemistry, which also houses arson. In terms of the remaining disciplines, right now there's just that's kind of up in the air whether we're going live with additional disciplines. But as per this moment, we're moving in the current disciplines that are live and accredited.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I've been in contact with some colleagues of mine in the Nassau County DA's office, and I'm not in panic mode, but I'm concerned about what I'm hearing. That and I'm probably the only one on the commission now that remembers the disaster that led us to where we are today. And one of the reasons that I had a lot of confidence in Nassau County was the selection of Pat Buffalino as the lab director. And I don't know how we do this procedurally, perhaps through you in contact with the government officials in Nassau, but I'm getting the impression that and I don't tell anybody how to run their budget. I have a $10 million budget that I run very well. I'm sure their budget is 100 times that. But I'm just concerned when I hear things like, well, the Department of Health is going to take over this section of the lab, and Pat Buffalino is going to be responsible to this person. Those things affect accreditation in my mind. And I feel that it would be incumbent upon this body to remind the leaders in Nassau County of the history of what occurred. I suspect some of them might not even be aware of it, and that we're greatly concerned about this transition to the new building. I want to, clearly one of the things that affects accreditation is the independence and the competency of the lab director. And I think we've all seen Pat Buffalino operate over the last several years on this commission. And when I hear things like, well, we don't have room for low copy DNA testing. I mean, good grief, what are you going to do? You're going to write a book on transportation in 1910 and not talk about the combustion engine? I mean, good grief. I understand people have to save money, but I don't know how to translate that quite into action, Mr. Chairman, but I think some communication by you to the Nassau County executive might be appropriate, if not an initial audit by ANAB.
So this is an issue that has also come to my attention, and certainly, while I wasn't here, I've read the IG's report that you referred to, and through documentation and conversations, am familiar with that history, and I agree with you. We're not, or at least it doesn't appear to me we're at a point now that we were, with NASA back then. I would hate to see this go in that direction. Pat, I guess one of the things, that would be helpful to me is a better understanding of what's happening. So one issue that concerned me is it my understanding that you're not going to have a firearms section in the new lab?
Well, the section is there and it's built. As to whether we're moving forward and when we're moving forward, that it's just, it's something that's in discussion.
So as of now, there's no clear plan in terms of who's going to do firearm-related testing in Nassau County?
I mean, personally, I don't believe that firearms is going to be one of the disciplines that's going to be removed from the scope of accreditation. But as of now, we haven't hired. We've set the discipline up, but we haven't hired for firearm examiners yet.
And as far as you're aware of, is there any definite plan that you're aware of as to when you're going to get the resources and be able to hire people?
At this point, I don't have a definitive answer.
So who's going to do firearms testing for Nassau County?
Well, I'm hoping it will be the laboratory, but again, they're exploring certain options.
And none of this gives me great comfort.
Well, I think we have to appreciate the position that Pat.
Well, no, I'm not directing this at Pat.
No, I know, but I mean, we're
just saying
questioning
I'm not
him.
getting-
His boss might be listening to this conversation, with the county executive, but
None of that is directed to Pat. I'm just saying
Understood.
overall, when the lab director, doesn't have enough information to give us guidance as to what the plan is for how firearms are going to be done in Nassau County or when they're going to be online.
last time I checked, there's still some serious gun crimes being committed in Nassau County.
In terms of DNA, can you give me some idea, from what do you have concrete commitments for right now in terms of the scope of the DNA testing that you'll be doing in this new laboratory? Not what you hope to do or what, but what do you have concrete commitments for right now in terms of either you have the staff or you have solid commitments that you'll be able to hire the staff, and have the resources to do what in terms of DNA testing?
At this point, we're not asking for any additional hires in DNA. We're just moving the discipline from one location to another. We're just trying to reorganize the discipline, knowing that there is a potential that we might lose some square footage.
All right, and if you lose that square footage, how, if at all, is that going to impact your ability to do the testing that you currently do?
Well, what was incorporated into the new scheme was additional evidence examination space, since that's generally every DNA laboratory's backlog is processing evidence and then writing reports. So we have 2 evidence exam rooms now. In the current location, we built a third, which would be a multi-community or multi-discipline room. There's some discussion of potentially losing that space there. So it basically just negates any future. I guess what I'm trying to say is part of DNA is backlog and also assuring that you don't create additional backlogs. We were looking to go from, I believe, and Karen's here, but I believe how many days are we right now? DNA. Probably around 60, 70 days. Our hopes were to come down to the federal's 30-day backlog on DNA evidence. It just makes that a little bit harder. It doesn't prevent us from getting our DNA cases done in any way, though. The other location was an area where we were considering not real-time, rapid PCR. and potentially setting up, our databases so that we would have a quicker response for arrestees and so forth. It's since it's a low and a high instrument at the same time, we came up with a location that we called Preamp 3, or the low-level area, that was going to house next-generation sequencing and also the rapid instruments. And what I mean by next-gen would be we wanted to go back into MITO and then start research on next-gen.
And you're indicating that if you don't get that additional space, would that impact your ability to do those things?
The answer is, I'm having a difficult time having a low and a high level instrument in an area. Where do you put it in low level? Do you put it in high level? I haven't gotten past the point of where I would put the instrumentation, given the loss of those specific areas. We'll make do with what we have.
Are there other concerns that you have with regard to the new space or the outfitting of the new space or the building, the infrastructure? Any other concerns you have with the new space in terms of it being structured in a way that would negatively impact your operations?
Really, until I'm given a final as to how the workflow is going to be. There are obviously some security concerns of how do we get to organizations on different security systems where one organization doesn't have access to the others. So right now I'm having discussions with the security contractor in terms of whether we need to rewire, whether we need to bifurcate the systems, or whether we can still use the same system and have the same level of security that we have right now. Again, without really having a definitive answer as to what our floor plan will be, it's a little bit difficult for me right now to give information as to what my concerns are.
How far away are you from the move-in date right now?
For DNA latents and drugs, we have a 50% move by mid-month, and all the instrumentation is there. Agilent has been doing some verifications. Our SEM is ready to operate. In terms of DNA, we have Thermo Fisher, we have a conference call Monday. We'll know when that date is to have them come, but we've been working constantly to have things move over, so we're in good shape for 50%. The question is, when can we move the other 50%? And that's really all dependent upon security, floor plan, and obviously asked by the approval of the information we provide to them.
Mid-month this month?
We've been moving stuff, so 50%, not to go live casework, but to have the instruments there so verifications begin. We're hoping by April, mid-April, the end of April, casework will commence in the new locations for those disciplines.
And did I understand you right that even though you're in the process of moving and that you don't have a floor plan yet as to what your space is going to be?
I just received something yesterday that gives me an idea of what the thought process is. But I don't have an official. I mean, I have an official as to what it is now. I just don't have a final say as to what it will be if changes are made.
All right. And is ANAB, if you know, going to come and do a physical inspection of the space before you start operation and testing again?
It's dependent on their response. Whether we're sending floor plans, photos as to where equipment is located, the security plans. That's really up to ANAB as to whether they need to come back at this point. We're really not at that stage yet.
All right, and please don't take anything from my questions. I'm not in any way questioning you. I'm just trying to make sure that we have as good an understanding of the situation, as we can as a commission. We certainly appreciate all the work that you're doing and appreciate the situation that you're in. Does anyone else on the commission have any questions? Do you have a motion, Bill?
Well, thinking out loud, I know that Maddie Singas, the DA in Nassau, is not going to stand for this. And she doesn't need a lot of help in fighting her battles. But I would wait. No, I don't want to wait. I would move that this commission, contact the officials in Nassau County. I think they have a county executive system, and express our deep concern to them that they're perhaps unaware or unappreciative of the previous history of this laboratory and how lucky they are now to have this new facility and this new lab director. And secondly, to request ANAB to do an immediate audit of the space allocation and the needs and whether or not they reflect the proper laboratory needs.
And I guess maybe adding to that, if we can, I would like some kind of report from ANAB, when the move is final. I'd like to know that ANAB went there, looked at the operation, looked at the space, and said, yes, we think everything's okay, and we think that they can operate in this space and meet the accreditation requirements.
Yeah, that was, however, inartfully I expressed it. That was the second point in my motion, that they do it before they move in, so that we don't compound the problem. I mean, I get,
That's
reading.
That's information that we definitely would have to provide to you. So it's going to be part of the accreditation process, so it is something that DCJS is going to receive.
Yeah, I'm just saying, as a commission, I don't want ANAB to make a decision after they get stuff as to whether or not they go there. As a commission, I would like to direct ANAB to go there.
Yes.
And physically look at the space and talk to Pat and understand what's happening and give us feedback as to whether or not it's sufficient before they get up and running. So so I guess two parts to your motion, if I understand it, basically. Yes. One, we reach out to the county executive and express concern given the history, make sure they understand it. And two, that we reach out to ANAB and tell them that we need a site visit and inspection prior to Nassau, becoming operational at the new site.
Yeah, and however you express it. I mean, again, we're not qualified to run Nassau County's budget, but I think everybody in the room knows what's going on here. Let's save a couple of bucks here. Let's get this on the cheap. Let's move this other thing in there, and it won't be a big deal. And what's this? It's only a lab. This is the engine that runs the criminal justice system in Nassau County that allows prosecutors and defense lawyers to either convict or exonerate people, and they got to understand that.
Yeah, no, without agreeing or disagreeing with all the details of your statement there,
yep.
I certainly agree with the final statement with regard to the importance of making sure this is properly resourced and making sure they understand the history. I think it was just maybe 9 years ago. So do we have a second for that motion? Basically the two prongs, that we reach out to Nassau and that we reach out to NAB with regard to an inspection.
Sure.
All right. Any discussion? And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And any abstentions? All right, so Pat is abstaining. Thank you. And again, Pat, I hope I didn't put you on the spot with my questions, but we appreciate the work you're doing and look forward to getting an update.
Okay. Thank you. And not at all. Look, we all have different visions, though. It's just it's at this point I'm just waiting for a decision to be made.
All right.
Commissioner Green, can I just ask a quick question?
Please.
It's just for clarification purposes, just that on the paperwork, Pat, on your letter, you write acting director of crime laboratory, and I'm not understanding why you're the acting director of the crime laboratory, but you're also the laboratory director. I just wanted to get clarification.
So essentially, I'm currently still the director of the forensic DNA laboratory. I've just never been given the title of director for the crime lab.
All right, anything else? All right, the next item we have is an update with regard to familial search. Jill?
So for familial search, we have received 24 unique applications. And the breakdown out of those 24 applications is that 1 was withdrawn, 4 have been rejected, 12 have been approved, and of those 12, we have completed and given results for 3 searches. 1 is currently in process, and 8 are in the queue to still be processed. We have 7 of the remaining that are in various stages of review throughout the process.
Any questions? Next, Rapid DNA, and this is just a follow-up at the last meeting. The commission voted that there would be letters sent out to law enforcement agencies, DA's offices, and laboratories, reiterating the commission's position that before anyone employs this technology, that it has to go before the DNA subcommittee and the commission, and it's my understanding those letters have all been sent out.
Yes, they have.
All right. Any questions on that item?
Who have they been sent to? How many?
I think there's roughly 550 law enforcement agencies in the state or police departments. We send them to all district attorneys' offices.
All district attorneys.
And all of the accredited laboratories in the state.
Have we received anything back?
Did we send them certified?
We sent them certified, so we have been receiving the receipts back, as well as someone did follow up by email saying that they had received it. So.
And any statements or comments back from any of the agencies?
None so far.
So next, we have laboratory disclosures. First is the Monroe County Crime Laboratory, and there's a closeout on 2 different disclosures. We do have John Clark from Monroe County Lab. John, if you could come up, maybe if you could just explain each of these 2 cases for us, please, or 2 situations for us.
Certainly. Good morning.
Morning.
These are 2 disclosures we reported last year. One was a false positive in the firearm section, and that corrective action was completed and that was closed out. And the second was an issue of a missing item in the drug section, and that corrective action has also been closed out.
Maybe starting with the firearms, can you just, what happened? What was the false positive? Was there an examination and someone said that cartridge casings matched when in fact they didn't?
Yes, that is correct. It was a comparison of test fires to a fired cartridge case, both of the same make and model firearm. Later on that year, a second examiner discovered that that error, and then which prompted us to start our corrective action and look into that.
Was there a root cause analysis done in terms of, why that happened or what happened?
Yes, there was. So, of course, anytime you do these root cause analysis, it's difficult to hone in on any one cause. We do believe, though, it had to do with rushing. At the time, we did have some people out on medical leave, which, when you do have a small staff, it creates an urgency, and it's not that laboratory management or our customers were putting pressure, but it was a self-imposed pressure by the analysts involved.
And what was done in terms of a corrective action with regard to the analyst, and/or was there anything done in terms of laboratory process?
We certainly went back and re-examined the examiner's past comparison work. We changed our procedures in terms of photo documentation, specifically for the verifying examiner. And they both examiners, both the examiner that worked the case and the verifying examiner, received some additional training, and they were both competency tested.
So just to make sure I understand factually, on the initial false positive, was it both the examiner and the verifier that came to the conclusion which ultimately turned out not to be correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And was there a lab report that was sent out as a result of that?
Yes, and we did notify the agencies involved.
So it was a new report then was sent out?
Yes.
Right. Anyone else have questions?
Yeah, was anybody arrested as a result of the test?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. This isn't really a question for John, but curious to see what Scott and David and Ben think. Does that almost become a Giglio issue for the examiner?
In terms of having to disclose it?
Yeah, like a year later, you have them in court. Does the lab have to disclose that a year ago he screwed up or she screwed up?
Well, you'd certainly, I think, have to disclose it if it was on the current case. In terms of prior information, in terms of how well the analyst performs, probably so as well. But that one's a little, I think, less clear.
I don't know. I don't know the answer.
I'd want to turn it over.
Yeah, I think the safer course is.
Hey, you just have to explain it, you know.
Right. Particularly if he has the other information too, where they went through. I think they went through his past 25 cases, so it's something the jury should know, but the entire breadth of it. Yeah, I have just a quick question. You said as to the reviewing person, you changed the procedures, I guess, to. Because it's understandable, I guess, that the person who was initially doing it felt rushed. But I'm just curious as to the reviewer, because that's sort of the stopgap to, for the lab to prevent against, someone who's self-imposing pressure. What were the procedures before, I guess, and what did you change them to?
Well, for a verification, the process would be for the second examiner to perform an independent microscopic examination, record their notes, and then sign that what their finding is. However, previous to this, we didn't have the verifying examiner taking photographs of the area of interest they were using.
Oh, so he's actually playing a more active role.
Yes.
I got it. Yeah. Makes sense.
With regard to the drug evidence, again, can you just give us a description of what actually happened there?
Yes. A drug chemist performed an analysis on the item, sealed the item up, wrote the report, had put the item in their personal evidence locker. Several months later, that chemist noticed that this item of evidence was still in their custody in our software system. That chemist brought that to the attention of lab management. So they self-reported it. We searched the entire lab. The thought is that either bigger items were put on top of it, or it was put in with another case and went back to a separate agency. We, of course, called all of our customers. We looked at all the cases that were worked on around the same time frame, called back some of those cases to search inside of those packages. We never did locate the item. And then the last part of what we had to do is meet with the employee along with their union representation.
What was the item?
It was a small amount of cocaine. I think it was 2.8 grams.
And were there any changes to your process as a result of this? Or?
Yes. Prior to this corrective action, the analysts were required to hold on to the evidence before the case was reviewed. Sometimes that review was delayed. So now we have the analysts returning the evidence immediately after they're done with their work. And we also are conducting spot audits of evidence in the custody of analysts. Prior to that, we would only audit or do evidence checks of physical locations. So we didn't want to disturb the casework flow, so we weren't auditing analysts of items in their custody.
Anyone else have any questions?
Do you have cameras in any of these areas?
Not in the drug section, no.
In the drug section.
So when you say that you, excuse me, when you say that you do a spot audit, is the analyst notified ahead of time, or does someone just show up at their work area and say, "Hi, I'm doing an audit of your area"?
It is an unannounced audit. Myself and the quality manager will choose analysts at random and then audit what they have in their custody.
Thank you.
Scott, do you have anything else? Pat, go ahead.
John, it's a quick question. It's irrelevant to, well, I don't know if it's too irrelevant, but are you guys digital in firearms, or is it just, is it still a manual process?
Digital in terms of what? The photography?
The whole flow, of casework. So it would be photography. Are your comparisons done digitally, or is that all done without the use of digitization and a workspace, let's say like Mideo?
We do have digital cameras, of course, to record those photographs, and they're stored electronically. However, the notes are manually done.
Okay.
Just a quick question. It's just a nit or a red flag. But you said that the person was interviewed with the union representative. Was there any other concern? One, had the person mishandled evidence before, or was there any other concern about this particular analyst that's beyond just doing casework and improperly?
There was absolutely no concern about the analysts. They still are a very good employee. It's just we were bound by the rules of the union to allow that person to have their representation available.
And so there was, as far as you know, nothing untoward about it, just because it's an issue with drugs and the handling of drugs and the missing of,
Correct. We didn't believe that employee took it. However, we wanted to make sure we took all the steps in our investigation.
You did indicate this was self-reported too, right?
Yes.
I didn't hear that. Thank you.
I have one other question. It doesn't relate to these two at all, but I've had a couple calls. My understanding is your lab serves 8 or 9 other counties around Monroe County.
Yes.
Is that arrangement changing at all?
It has been changing. So several years ago, we changed the way the costs are determined. We had our budget office do an audit of our operations so we can nail down more closely what it's costing us to provide these services. Certainly, so Monroe County is, recouping its costs for the analysis. And some of those agencies were not happy with the rise in cost, of course, so they chose to go elsewhere.
I don't know that this falls under the commission, but just, and that we have, if there's entities that aren't using you, it could impact the state police or it could impact, the state in other regards. I would ask as a courtesy, if you could, if you have labs that do go elsewhere, if you could just let us know, offline, just so that we have an understanding of what's happening and what the resource needs might be. That'd be helpful.
Absolutely, and I apologize for that.
No, I don't think it falls under the commission. I'm just asking as a courtesy. No apology necessary. So thank you. Anyone else have any question? All right, thank you very much. Next, we have the Monroe County Office of the Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. My understanding that this relates to a report about a positive drug result that then tested negative. The error was noticed when there was a discovery request and a subpoena. The ADA was notified. Ultimately, an amended report was issued. And then it was determined that the error was due to manually typing the results into a report. So it wasn't a testing issue, but it was an issue, as I understand it, related to the typing of information into the final report. ABFT has acknowledged receipt of the notification and hasn't raised any issues. Rebecca Hartman is available by phone if anyone has any questions. Is there any questions? Does anyone want to ask Rebecca Hartman anything? No. Next, we have the Nassau County Medical Examiner Department of Forensic Toxicology. There were a number of letters and emails. We do have Joe Vella here, and this is an initial notification with regard to a negative blood alcohol report and what appeared to be a sample switch. And maybe, Joe, if you're still there, if you could just give us a brief summary of what happened and what you're doing.
Yeah, Commissioner, I would say that actually we are considering this a closed matter, so it's not initial. We had it notified on this earlier, so I hope you have all the documents that we submitted. The laboratory identified the problem. I mean, we've done our investigation. We did not find any other issues. Following an examination of the analyst's casework, other analysts' casework around the same time period, we did make several corrective actions. You know, in the spirit of root cause, sometimes you find things that even if they weren't necessarily the exact problem, you find things that may have contributed. So we looked to do what we could to strengthen the protocol. Trainings have been completed. As I said, you know, we are in the process of downloading our SOP to Qualtrics. So the final implementation, or I shouldn't say necessarily implementation, but the final version of the SOP is still in the works. But in terms of training and everything else, we've used the new protocol. We are holding the analyst off, that's just our way, I guess. Not probably necessary, but it's just our way to hold the analyst off. We wanted to give the commission an opportunity just to have a look at what we did and make sure they didn't have any issues with it. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions.
I've got a quick question.
Go ahead, Pat.
So it's odd because you're only a floor up from me, but I'll ask you across the table here. So obviously you know how big I am with digitization, and if the data was still somewhere on the network, we probably wouldn't be here discussing this. Has there been anything put in place to assure that the data does not get deleted, lost? Is it being backed up on the server?
Yeah. So you know, let me expand on that a little bit. We have looked at this area extensively. Again, as I mentioned earlier, so that we are in compliance with 17025. But also, you know, we have in place, just in terms of good laboratory practice, we were retaining data digitally. Our files, we consider those files to be the document of record, if you will. But in terms of good laboratory practice, we were retaining electronic versions of all of this data locally on the drive related to the instrument, and then it was being backed up to our server. This is one instance where this instrument actually allowed the data to be overwritten, and that was part of the corrective action, was to I think in the corrective action that we provided to you folks here, we hadn't yet determined that we could make the change to the instrument. That change has been implemented. So that data can no longer be overwritten accidentally.
Okay.
It's not possible.
Good.
It will be stored on the C drive, and it will be transferred to the T drive or to a server subsequent to that.
So it's going to get backed up. Okay.
Correct.
Because I mean, my opinion is always if you had the original copy, it's always the best practice.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Mike has another question, but he got pulled out of the room for something urgent. So if you could just wait.
Disclosures are made in general and then more specific if he testified that he testified and he testified well and explained it. So, am I saying that?
I would probably like to see at some point as well. So, you know, I don't know if it'll ever happen in 1 minute. The way we used to do this, we used to hear, you know,
Yeah, but I mean, even as that goes, the
And-
clerk calls everything we do in Nassau County rules. No, but standardization, but preferable. What is it that they do in the city that you see as being
I
different?
don't think they bring it up on at all.
Yeah, as soon as the meeting's done, I'll have him come up to the office and vote it right. Okay. We should have been done at noon. My apologies. Do we still have Joe there?
Yeah, and
Yeah, I'm still here, Commissioner.
Joe, I apologize. I had to step out for a minute, but I was a little confused. I wanted to make sure I understood what happened right. As I read this and as I'm listening, it sounds like there was a run, and that for some reason it didn't run the way it was supposed to, and it was overwritten.
Correct.
And then it was run again, and there was a report put out, and then it was discovered, and I'm not quite sure how this happened, that result wasn't accurate, and maybe there was a sample switch, and ultimately there was something run again that got a different result, and a different report was put out. Am I even close at all here?
Yeah, you're close.
All right. Maybe if you can just give me a little clarification on exactly what happened there.
Sure. So we had a run that was performed, and there was a failure of one of the QC samples in the batch. So a batch is, can be any number of samples, but typically 2, 3, 5 samples are run together in a batch. The nature of the failure of the QC was not due to its performance, but more so that the instrument actually stopped. And what the analyst did was to notate the problem, cleaned the instrument, did some, basic instrument maintenance, and then reran that batch. Ultimately, to cut to the chase, so to speak, the positive samples in that batch were designated to be reanalyzed completely. There was one negative sample, which by laboratory standards is okay to report. If we repeated it, we assumed it would continue to be negative. That's when we determined that there was actually a sample switch, because that one negative was reported, but the 2 positive samples in that batch came back and one was negative, and we knew that couldn't be, that was the how we determined that there was a switch. So that was the moment that we notified the DA's office. Here we are. The 2 positives, I should say all of the samples were repeated subsequent to that. We took the further step to repeat them independently, so each sample was run by itself on a different day, so there could be no question in anyone's mind as to what the results that should be attributed to it would be. And then, of course, we did our, at the same time we were doing our interviews, we did not report anything until we were satisfied that we had an isolated problem, that it wasn't a problem that could have somehow bled into another analysis or something like that. So we held off the reports for a couple of weeks. One thing I would just maybe say is that if you'll notice, from the initial analysis until the time that we reported, about 20 days had passed, and I think that also contributed to, why we didn't identify the problem sooner, and how that and it contributed to that report actually being released. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's roughly what happened.
That's helpful. So 2 follow-up questions. One, with regard to the case where the report was issued, or for that matter, any of these cases where a report was issued with regard to this run, is all of this information documented and disclosed to the DA's office with regard to what happened here?
Yes.
All right. And secondly, if you could just, I see you have someone at the table with you. If you could just identify yourself for us.
Yeah, Commissioner Green, this is Maureen McCormick from the Nassau DA's
office. Hi, Maureen.
Hi,
I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you.
It's okay. I only really wanted to add the fact that, yes, we did receive a disclosure from the lab immediately, then met with the lab members to discuss the root cause analysis, the review of all of the analysts' work that demonstrated that he had not had any other issue in any of the 250 or so samples, something like that. I did want to let the commission know that the office is disclosing the fact that this analyst had been involved in this incident in a general way on all of his cases, and then in a more particular way with more detailed information if the case is going to trial. In particular, I wanted the commission to know that the analyst, in fact, testified yesterday for the first time with full disclosures, was cross-examined, and it proceeded as you would expect. It proceeded properly. All things were done as you would have expected. But the disclosures are being made on all of his cases.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to be here and share that information with us, and I guess more importantly, appreciate the way that both of you handled this situation. And anyone else have any questions or comments?
Commissioner Green, I just have a quick comment.
Yes,
Pat alluded to it. Sorry, not Pat. Joe alluded to it in his comments, but it was also in an email that was sent from Jill Dooley, and I just think it's important to mention it, that in some of the documents that Joe, I need my comment.
Making you feel really good here.
I apologise. In a comment that Joe had made, that the analyst would remain inactive in DWI BAC programme pending satisfaction of the Commission of Forensic Science. And then Jill had sent an email back just to explain that the Commission would not make a specific recommendation to Nassau County in regards to a personnel or staffing decision when it comes to placing the examiner back online with casework. I just think it's good to have it on record, because a lot of the lab directors, I'm sure, they're thinking about how they want to move forward with their resources, but they also know they have to present in front of the Commission. So it's good to see that the Commission believes in the process that we're going through, where the lab directors have the decision on what goes on at the lab and then needs to communicate that to the Commission and receive their feedback. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Thank you.
Commissioner, if I could just go back for a second to the rest of the crime lab, I did just want to note for the record that the county executive's office, through the deputy county executive, Helena Williams, is in contact with the district attorney. And in fact, there will be a meeting this afternoon about some of the issues that were expressed here. And we appreciate the commission's concern on behalf of Nassau County. Thank you.
Thank you. And if there are significant developments that you think we should be aware of, maybe through Mr. Fitzpatrick, you could keep us apprised.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Next, we have the New York City Police Department Police Laboratory. If I'm reading this correctly, there's two separate issues on both of them from letters dated February 14th of this year. Scott, do you want to just give us a brief summary?
Commissioner, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask my QA manager, Jennifer Lady, to come to the table.
Sure.
And she will give the summary.
Hi, Jennifer Lady, Quality Assurance Manager. The two issues, one of them regarded the reporting of incorrect units on a drug report. It was a pure weight drug report, and the units were reported in grams instead of as milligrams, making it a significant difference in weight. That was actually reported to our laboratory by the ADA assigned to the case, who recognized that that amount seemed too large. When we found that out, we checked the case file. We realized it was simply a typo on the report, and we ran a report through our LIMS system and identified two other cases, one from 2017, one from 2016, that had the same type of error. For those earlier cases, both of them were dismissed. Both of them actually were pled to disorderly conduct, and so none of the drug charges were used, but we still did amended reports for two of the reports. One of them we had to reanalyze it because the original analyst had resigned by that point. We did a root cause analysis and concluded a couple things. One was the sort of the repetitive nature of the writing of reports, and the reviewing of reports just sort of caused a missed, some level of blindness when reviewing the reports. And we have a self-review checklist, which was intended for the analyst to look for very specific things that we find that would be most detrimental to our customers if it went out incorrectly. One of those would be the weight type, and that obviously did not work in this case. What we did to correct it, we are doing a few different things. We revised our checklist to be a little bit more explicit in its instructions, and also to have our technical review people use the checklist also. And that's in addition to the normal technical review. We also changed in our LIMS system, milligrams were reported as mg and grams were reported as g. And so we changed milligrams to spell out milligrams in the hope that there would be a larger visual difference on the laboratory report that would stand out to people. But I think the most significant change that we made is we're running a report daily that compares reports that have grams reported for pure weight charges, which should not happen, and that immediately flags any reports that have either been approved or in draft form that there's an error there. So we're running that every day, and we haven't seen any additional issues.
Any questions?
Just very briefly, for the older cases, from I think you said 2016, and I forget the year of the other, there were two cases where the pleas were to disorderly conducts. Did you notify, I guess it would be the prosecutor about those? And the concern is, I'm not sure it's entirely accurate that the lab tests weren't used in cases. Oftentimes what happens if there's a lower weight, someone pleads to a disorderly conduct. So I was just wondering whether you reported out to I guess whoever was involved in those cases.
Yes, we did reach out to the DA's offices, and they're the ones who told us that it was pled to disorderly conduct. That's how we got our information directly from the customer.
And you don't have, I guess you wouldn't have any information as to whether that was sent on to defense counsel or?
No.
Yeah, it's just a concern. Obviously I don't know anything about those particular cases, just generally. It's a little bit of a misnomer to say that those reports aren't used at all, because they are part of the prosecution that winds up in the disorderly conduct. Those cases wind up in fines or community service or what have you, but there are sentences as well.
But in this case, they would have been reporting out a significantly larger amount of drugs than what was really there, right? Because you're putting grams and it's really milligrams. So
was it the same error? I didn't get that it was
the way I understood it.
Was it the same?
Yeah,
was this
so,
precise error?
It would be to the defendant's benefit.
Well, unless they would have ACD'd it if they knew it was the lesser weight.
I don't know how they do it down there.
Well, I guess, it seems to me the first question is, and probably the end of our immediate inquiry is, as a lab, are you reporting these things? When you find these errors, are you reporting them to the district attorney's office? So if you sent a report that said grams and you later find out it's milligrams, are you correcting it and informing the DA's office of the change?
Yes.
All right, and then, I don't know that we can task the lab, other than maybe to indicate to you and Bill.
Prosecutor's responsibility.
Yeah, and, so maybe if you can just reiterate with the association that, I think there's been a valid concern raised that when things like this are communicated to the DA's office, if there's been a prosecution and a conviction, we would hope it gets passed on to the defense.
I would hope so. I know in our office it would be, even if it was post anything. You send a letter to the defense attorney and say, hey, just so you know, I was just notified by the lab, and then they can act accordingly. So,
Yeah, if someone wants to reopen disorderly conduct, please.
Right.
At their peril, they can do that.
Right.
All right. No, but I think they're valid points. And
No,
I appreciate
only
it.
because it doesn't seem like there are a lot of them, so it doesn't seem like there would be a lot of legwork, and like we're talking about a few cases per session as we're going through them.
No, I don't disagree.
I can just speak. I know, we don't deal with obviously them, but we deal with state police, and if there's ever an issue, we always send a letter to the defense attorney, and I would be very surprised if prosecutors throughout the state don't do the same thing.
I'm guessing D.A. Fitzpatrick does the same thing.
No, I'm progressive. We don't prosecute drug cases.
All right, thank you.
That's a lot of work.
All right, next we have the New York State Police Crime Laboratory. And again, I think there's two items here. I don't know, Ray, either you or if you have someone who wants to describe these for us.
Commissioner Green, I just want to make sure that there was 2 letters from the NYPD, so I just want to make sure that there was no other comments for the second letter.
I did not have any with regard to the second. I don't know if anyone else had any. That was with regard to the diazepam.
Pam, yeah, correct.
Okay, so we have the closure of two non-conforming work actions. The first has to do with a barcode, let's say switch, a misreading of it, and the assignment of incorrect samples to analysis. Those were detected during a routine follow-up of an endus match, and as a result, we had a resubmission of those known samples, confirmed that there was the incorrect analysis or assignment of analysis. We made the contact to both the DA's office and a criminal investigation command at Fort Drum, whose case it actually was, and issued the corrected report. We were informed by the DA's office that case was closed, and additionally, the criminal investigation command at Fort Drum advised that the case was found to be unfounded. So that was the conclusion of that, along with the corrective action, which we have on page 2, where we followed up with the evidence receiving unit to educate our folks and put corrective measures into place to make sure that was not going to reoccur. The second one was referencing a case where there's improper handling of a blood-soaked T-shirt. Again, this is the closure of that.
disclosed to the commission previously. So in that particular case, there was gunshot residue that was to be done on the case, but was a blood-soaked shirt as well. Came to the biosciences section first with advice to that analyst to stay away from the bullet hole so that the gunshot residue was not to be compromised in any way. Unfortunately, that advice was not adhered to, and there was a cutting that was taken too close to the hole, as well as a Sharpie marker designating where the cutting was taking place. So as a result, the gunshot residue was compromised and could not be conducted appropriately. So we advised the agency. Various work was reviewed from the analyst and found to be in compliance as well, a proficiency test, which was passed successfully. That individual voluntarily entered into service retirement. So with notification, the submitting agency advised that while it would have given pertinent information, there was witnesses who could testify to the incident. So hence we closed it with those corrective actions. Be happy to entertain any questions.
Any questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have the Suffolk County Crime Lab, and this, if I understand the email chain correctly, is an issue with regard to the refrigerator, and I believe refrigeration temperature that was brought to attention with regard to some molding of evidence that occurred. It's my understanding that the documentation provided indicated that the lab has gone through a monitoring phase, that the temperature is regulated properly, and that this incident is closed. If anyone does have any questions, Bob Jen is available by phone. Anything? All right. Next, we have the Suffolk County Office of the Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. And this is two separate email chains with regard to, I believe there's just two separate issues. It's a reporting error and a closeout with regard to an ethanol proficiency testing issue. And again, Bob Detling is available by phone if anyone has any questions. And next, we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology, and this is it's a drug-facilitated proficiency test. There was a nonconformance with regard to the proficiency test. It looks like it was a toxicology proficiency test, and that the lab didn't report the presence, it looks like, if I'm reading this correctly, of two substances, that upon retesting they were both identified. We do have Chris Cording available by phone if anyone has any questions with regard to this. All right, so that is the end of our lab disclosures. We do have Laboratory Director Kathy Corrado here, and I believe Kathy did want to address the commission with regard to rapid DNA. Is that correct? And did give us the proper notice ahead of time indicating she wished to speak. So you probably should have done this under new business, but go ahead.
No, I apologize. It was after when you were talking about the rapid DNA, a question came up, so it wasn't something before. Thank you for letting me ask the question. I just for some clarification, I know that you sent the letter out asking that if any agency plans on using rapid DNA, that they're requested to appear before the DNA subcommittee. My question really is there any guidance or direction given to the DNA subcommittee about what they're to do when an agency comes before them? Because I have some concerns that the way it's written, the agency that's wanting to use it will bring their validation and their processes, but the DNA subcommittee, I'm not sure. When I watched the last DNA subcommittee meeting, may have been the last one or one before, I don't honestly remember, there seemed to be some confusion as to what their role is. And so certainly an agency that wants to employ rapid DNA could come and show their validation. I think the DNA subcommittee would probably be able to review the validation, but are they going to then review the policies and procedures as to how that's going to be used? Are they going to look at the issue of sample consumption? Because I think we're all very concerned about that. And it's not clear to me, does the DNA subcommittee know what their role is, and are they equipped? Do they feel like they're the right group to be looking at that? Or should there be, I think back when this first came up back in 2015, NICLAC had asked the commission, should there be some kind of regulations that the DNA subcommittee should be looking at for this? And I guess I just want to ensure that if an agency shows up to the DNA subcommittee at the next meeting and they're like, here's our validation and we're ready to go, and the DNA subcommittee says, okay, we looked at it, looks okay, is that all that it takes? I mean, what is the plan moving
forward? A couple of things. One is it's not all that it takes, because they would have to make a recommendation. That recommendation would have to come to the commission, and the commission would have to accept it before anything could happen. So, nobody could just show up to the DNA subcommittee, say, here it is, and the DNA subcommittee say, go ahead, go start tomorrow. The second issue I have is that rapid DNA can encompass a lot of different things in a lot of different situations, and to try and answer the questions that you posed in a vacuum without knowing what someone intends to do, I think is very difficult. For us to sit here and try and make regulations in advance covering every possible scenario seems to be an exercise in futility to me. I think that people, if someone wants to use it, it's incumbent on them to come forward and let us know exactly what it is they want to use, how they intend to use it. Are they using it for identification in connection with arrest processing? Are they using it to identify, single source forensic samples, as a screening process in a lab? Are they using it on mixtures at a crime scene and consuming samples? And for us to try and, ahead of time, figure out every possible scenario and set out regulations, personally to me, doesn't make sense. I think it makes a lot more sense if someone wants to use this, to have them come in and explain to the subcommittee and ultimately to the commission what they're doing and how they're doing it and, what the purpose is. And I think it would encompass all those things you just raised. Are there sample consumption concerns? Are they taking those into account? Do they have protocol? So I would anticipate that all those things would be part of the inquiry, but I just don't see how we come up with regulations ahead of time, or how the DNA subcommittee comes up with regulations ahead of time, not having any clue as to what people intend to use or how they intend to use it.
Yeah, I see that, and I agree. I guess maybe then my question is more, how do you anticipate this going? So an agency shows up at the DNA subcommittee meeting. What I'm hearing, I guess, is that it's not just that one time. So from when they provide information, there will be additional inquiries and things will progress. If that sounds like a good plan. I guess that's my concern is, or do these agencies think they're going to show up at the meeting and it's a done deal? They just show up, and that, because the way it's worded is you have to appear before the DNA subcommittee meeting, but I don't know how they know what happens after that.
And I guess it might be theoretically possible that someone has a use for this that doesn't fall within 995. We talked about that. Does 995 apply? And I can clearly think of situations where I think it does. Is it possible someone's using it in a way that doesn't? It's so... frankly, I think it's impossible to answer all these questions until we know what someone's going to do. So, is it theoretically possible that someone shows up in front of the DNA subcommittee and has everything in line, has laid out exactly what they intend to use, has the protocol in place to address every concern the subcommittee has validation studies that address all of that, lays it all out in a completely transparent way for the DNA subcommittee, and in that one meeting based on that, the DNA subcommittee says, yeah, this makes sense to us, we'll make a recommendation to the commission? Yeah, it's possible that could happen. It's also possible that someone shows up, says, this is what we want to do, and they don't have all of that. The subcommittee says, well, come back when you have this for us, because we're not in a position to make a recommendation yet. But in any event, as I said before, the DNA subcommittee, as I read it, doesn't have the authority to say, go ahead and go do this. What they have the authority to do is make a recommendation to the commission. and I know speaking for myself, I'm not going to approve anything unless I have answers to the questions you've raised. And, given the inquiry that other members of the commission have made and the things that they've expressed on the subject, I don't think they're going to either. So, I hear your concerns, but I just don't know how we proactively, prescribe rules that come up with every possible circumstance under which this could be used.
Okay. Well, I
I
appreciate
don't know if anyone else on
The only thing I would add is at our last meeting, Tim Kupfersmith from the OCME came in and talked about that he might use rapid DNA to help with identification of remains, and that and he set out sort of to us what the lab was thinking about doing. I imagine when he goes to the OCME, when he goes to the subcommittee, which I think he was planning on doing, he would go there with us, the validation studies that they had done, and have them review the work that the scientists at the OCME had done, and then the subcommittee can provide us with recommendations. What I don't think, and this is not speaking for the committee, but this is just off the cuff, is that when there was a presentation, and I don't think it was meant to be a presentation. I don't think it was meant to be a formal presentation of the subcommittee, but I know the New York City Police Department is thinking about using rapid DNA, and so they, I think, went there to get ideas about how they might progress. I think that's a different meeting or a different conversation than what we would anticipate with the subcommittee in terms of the organization has already looked at it, has done validation studies on their own, and has a plan that they're presenting to the subcommittee about how they are taking evidentiary samples, whether they're crime scene samples or swabs, and using them, and what that process would look like. And then the subcommittee would weigh in on that and send us a recommendation. That's sort of what I anticipate it being, but I think it's not simply a process of appearing before the subcommittee and saying I have an idea of.
Well, thank you. Go ahead.
I'm assuming that the lab directors have a position on this. Would that be fair to say? Have you guys talked about this at your meetings? And is it a concern to you guys if they were to start doing this, consuming the samples?
Yeah, I don't. We have spoken about it, and I'm not at this time speaking for the other lab directors at all. It is. I mean, I think I think we all see rapid DNA is here. It's coming, and it's a. I think everyone would agree it's a good science. I think we are concerned about just the regulation of it, because to make sure it's done right, to make sure that people understand. We have concerns when there's mixtures. Are they going to understand what that means? And I think the biggest, for me anyway, the larger issue is the consumption of sample. Our concern is if someone uses the last remaining bit of sample and their results are not admissible in court for whatever reason, then we don't have anything. And I think we're not. I think the lab directors, or I shouldn't say. I think our discussions. This is fair to say that we are concerned that it's just done right. And I really appreciate that the commission and that DCJS sent out the letter to these agencies asking for them to appear. I think I just wanted. It was a little confusing to me because I'm not sure if the DNA subcommittee, if they understand their role, or I shouldn't say it that way, but if it's clear to everyone what their role would be in this. And I just want to make sure that people are thinking about that, because it sounds to me like New York City Police Department definitely is moving forward, and it's possible there are other police agencies or other agencies outside of the police that are doing that as well. So we just want to make sure that it is being followed up on, I guess. So, and I really appreciate you allowing me to speak.
No, I appreciate you bringing your concerns here, and even as to the science, we haven't had a chance to fully vet this yet because no one's brought it before us, but my understanding is there may be some agreement about the science in some contexts, but I think there's some dispute about the science in other contexts, for example, mixtures. So I think all of that.
I think there's also like there's an interesting question as to what the role of the lab is, because I know a lot of the labs only until this point have only taken raw material and taken the raw material into the lab, and then they're the ones that did all of the testing and analysis and figured out what that raw material meant. Rapid DNA means that people who are not associated with a crime lab will be doing part of that. And so that's, so what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the relationship with law enforcement agencies? Like who's going to be doing that, whether the lab is going to accept them. So I think there are a lot of questions that are unanswered I think they're answerable. They are answerable questions, but they probably should be at first blush answered by the subcommittee and also the respective crime labs in terms of what evidence they're going to take into the lab and then analyze.
Yep.
Since you might be dealing with entities that aren't used to this system and aren't as used to quality assurance and validation procedures, there might be some value in the lab directors possibly working with the subcommittee to come up with a list of items that should be addressed when they come before the DNA subcommittee, including things like sample consumption and training of personnel and any other things that, over and above the actual SOP and validation of that might be important in terms of understanding the whole process and if it's going to work well.
Yeah, I'm certainly, anything the lab directors want to submit, we would certainly consider. And, I don't want to speak for Dwight, but I imagine he would as well. And at the end of the day, we're the ultimate check. If something goes before the subcommittee and it comes to us and we don't feel that they've considered everything that needs to be considered, whether it's who's going to do the testing or, what the impact is on sample consumption or whatever it might be, we always have the option of sending it back, and directing them to consider something in addition. So, but yeah, certainly to the extent that the lab directors do have concerns that they want to submit, we're happy to share those with the subcommittee.
And also, just the office, the Office of Forensic Services has been notified that at the May DNA subcommittee, there will be a presentation of a rapid validation. Director Cooper Schmidt reached out to us to let us know that he would be presenting.
And I think that's in connection with identification of remains, right? Which, what's certainly important is, presents different issues than someone at a crime scene, taking a forensic sample and trying to test whether they're standing at the crime scene. So, all of the context, will be important.
Yeah, I think we're hoping, obviously the laboratories will be following their normal procedures, and I think the laboratories will go through the process. I think we're more concerned about some of the agencies that are new to using that kind of technology. So
that are not laboratories.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
thank
that.
you. Appreciate it. All right, that's everything we have absent executive session. So next item we have is executive session. Do I have a motion to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to either current investigation or matters that may lead to the appointment, promotion, demotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular person? So moved. Do I have a second? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, we'll be going into executive session, so I would ask anyone who's not either a commission member or Office of Forensic Services staff to leave the room or leave our alternate site. Just take it. I believe so.
I don't believe so.
So I did have to file financial.
We're ready here.
All right, thanks, Greg. Are we all set?
Yep.
All right, so we're back in session. There was no action taken in executive session. I do believe that we had one other matter, Scott, that you wanted to deal with before we go on.
Yeah, Commissioner, I've had some concerns for a couple of years, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it to your attention. I know I've mentioned it to you in passing, but I still have concerns about Erie County's lab out there. I mean,
This is the toxicology lab specifically?
I mean, there was a couple years ago where we had the report, I think it was on the on-site report, and I really think that, and since we brought up Nassau County earlier, I mean, I just don't want to see us get into a situation like that. So I would ask the commission if we could just have that looked into before we get to their next on-site. And I'm not sure how it's going now with the transferring from one agency to another, but I'd really like to see us kind of look into that just so that we're on top of them before it becomes a big problem down the road.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, historically, I think what you're referring to is their actual reaccreditation. At the last reaccreditation, there were a significant number of findings. It did take some time for us to get to the bottom of all of those being addressed. In addition, if I remember right, back in 2016, I believe there was an issue raised with the commission about the structure of the lab, and specifically the structure of the quality assurance. So I think given those things, I certainly understand where you're coming from. I believe they're up for an off-site inspection this year from ABFT or whatever the entity is, ABFT, ANAB. So my suggestion would be that rather than an off-site, we ask ABFT or ANAB to actually do the equivalent of an on-site mid-cycle inspection this year.
I'd feel more comfortable with that, just based on the amount of nonconformities last time.
All right, do you make that motion?
I would make that motion.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. Any discussion with regard to that motion? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? All right, and any abstentions? All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Our next meeting is June 7th in New York City. And other than that, I believe that we've completed our agenda. So do I have a motion to adjourn?
It's for me.
And second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, anyone opposed? All right, and again, just thank you to both the staff for the tremendous amount of work that all of you have done putting this material together for us and helping us through this, and to all the commission members for the time and effort you put into this. Thank you. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.